The Soviet Union tested weapons no other country would dare test on itself. It dropped a nuclear bomb over its own troops, then ordered 45,000 soldiers to march straight into the blast. It built a biological weapons lab on an island so secret that the sea around it eventually disappeared, leaving the site connected to dry land. It buried tons of live plutonium inside a mountain, then walked away. Some of these places are still radioactive. Some are still sealed. One was never shut down. And the site that should worry you most is not the one you'd expect. Start in the steppe of eastern Kazakhstan, at a lake that looks completely ordinary. Round, calm, ringed by dry grass. Locals fish here. Cattle drink from it. Nothing about it looks wrong, except this lake didn't form. It was made. On January 15, 1965, the Soviet Union detonated a 140 kiloton nuclear device buried nearly 600 feet under a dry riverbed here, and the explosion punched a crater 400 meters wide and 100 meters deep straight into the earth. Then they let it fill with water and called it a success. This wasn't a weapons test in the traditional sense. It was part of a Soviet program called Nuclear Explosions for the National Economy, the idea that atomic bombs could be used as construction tools. Dig reservoirs, carve canals, reshape rivers, deepen harbors, even help drill for oil. Over the following years, the program would go on to detonate more than 100 devices under this same theory, chasing an idea the Americans had also tried and largely abandoned, that nuclear weapons could double as excavation equipment for peacetime engineering. The Soviets were so confident in it that they filmed one of their own ministers, the man in charge of the entire Soviet nuclear weapons program, swimming in the crater lake to prove it was safe. Water from it was later used to feed livestock in the surrounding region. But the peaceful explosion didn't stay contained. About a fifth of the blast's radioactive material escaped into the atmosphere, and traces of it were detected as far away as Japan, a violation on paper of a treaty banning atmospheric nuclear tests. The Soviets denied it. The Americans complained. Nothing changed. And the lake is still there. Locals still call it the Atomic Lake. Tests have shown its water carries roughly 100 times the radiation considered safe for drinking water. People still swim in it anyway, and still fish from it, even though the smell alone is enough to warn nearby settlements when the wind shifts. A weapon built to prove that Soviet engineering could reshape nature instead left behind something that just quietly poisons a landscape for generations, long after anyone remembers what national economy it was supposed to serve. If a peaceful test could do that to a lake, the next site shows what happened when the Soviets stopped pretending their tests were peaceful at all and turned the weapon on their own army. September 14, 1954, a field in Orenburg Oblast, Russia. Today, there's a modest stone marker here. Nothing dramatic, but this is the spot where the Soviet Union detonated a live nuclear bomb specifically to study what would happen to its own soldiers standing nearby. The exercise was codenamed Snowball. Marshal Georgy Zhukov was in command. A bomber dropped a 40-kiloton device, roughly twice the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and it exploded 350 meters above the ground. Around 45,000 troops, 600 tanks, and 320 aircraft took part in the operation. The goal was to find out whether an army could fight through a nuclear strike and keep moving. Forward units were positioned as close as 2.5 kilometers from where the bomb would land. So within under an hour of detonation, soldiers wearing little more than gas masks and cloth capes were ordered to march directly into the blast zone. They weren't told the full truth. Many believe this was a routine exercise being filmed for training purposes, not a live experiment on their own bodies. Survivors were sworn to 25 years of silence. Some had their military records deliberately falsified, which meant that decades later, when they developed radiation-linked illnesses, doctors had no paperwork connecting their condition to that day, and many were turned away. How many people were permanently affected is still disputed. Some records from the era were reportedly destroyed. The full picture may never be known. What is known is that this stayed classified until after the Soviet Union itself collapsed, meaning the state that ordered it outlived its own willingness to admit it happened by less than a decade. Totskoye proved the Soviets were willing to gamble with their own soldiers out in the open. The next site shows what they were willing to bury underground, quietly, for decades, without ever officially admitting it was there. Back in Kazakhstan, at the same Semipalatinsk test complex, there's a mountain called Deadliest. From the outside, it looks like any other rocky formation on the steppe. Inside, it's honeycombed, with over 100 man-made tunnels, not built to hide people, but built to hide explosions. Soviet engineers used these tunnels to run underground nuclear tests, including experiments on how plutonium behaves when it's struck by conventional explosives, all without triggering a full detonation. Roughly 215 underground nuclear tests were carried out inside this single mountain. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the military that had run this site for decades simply left. What they left behind was staggering. Tunnels sealed shut, but packed with an estimated over 200 kilograms of recoverable plutonium, enough by some estimates for dozens of nuclear weapons sitting essentially unguarded in the ground. It didn't stay unguarded for long, but not for the reason you'd hope. Local residents, desperate after the economic collapse that followed independence, broke into the tunnels with mining equipment to strip copper wiring and steel rails for scrap metal. They had no idea what they were standing next to. American engineers began sealing entrances in the 1990s, but by the time a full effort resumed in 2004, they discovered that 110 of the 181 tunnels they had already closed had been reopened again. After the September 11th attacks, American and Russian scientists finally treated the site as a real security emergency, working for 17 years and roughly $150 million before declaring it secure in 2012. A mountain built to keep a nuclear secret buried nearly became the opposite, an open-air plutonium supply discovered by scrap thieves before it was ever discovered by nuclear inspectors. If a mountain of unexploded plutonium could sit unguarded for years, one Soviet site went even further. It wasn't built to test explosions at all. It was built to test something that spreads without ever detonating. Between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, there used to be an island in the Aral Sea. It doesn't function as an island anymore because the sea around it mostly disappeared. What's left behind is one of the strangest and most dangerous sites on this entire list. The Soviet Union's primary open-air biological weapons testing range, codenamed Aralsk 7. Starting in the 1950s, Soviet scientists used this isolated island to field test weaponized pathogens on live animals: anthrax, plague, smallpox, tularemia, brucellosis, botulinum toxin. Samples were shipped in from a network of secret biological weapons cities scattered across the USSR, places most of the world never associated with germ warfare, then flown or ferried out to the test zones. The island even had its own dedicated airfield, built with 4 intersecting runways so aircraft could land regardless of which direction the wind was blowing. A closed military town called Kantubek grew up around the lab, housing roughly 1,500 people at its peak, completely cut off from the outside world. In July 1971, according to a later account from a Soviet general involved in the weapons program, a field test of aerosolized smallpox drifted further than intended and reportedly caused an outbreak that killed civilians in a nearby city, a story the Soviet government suppressed for more than 3 decades. Some specifics of that account remain disputed, but the broader pattern doesn't. This was a program willing to risk contamination beyond its own fences. Then the Soviet Union's own agricultural ambitions did something no weapons inspector ever managed. Massive irrigation projects drained the rivers feeding the Aral Sea to grow cotton, and the sea began to vanish. By the 2000s, the water around the island had retreated so far that the island simply connected to the mainland. A landmass built specifically because it could be sealed off by water stopped being sealed off at all. The lab shut down in 1992. The entire town was evacuated in a single day. Residents were told it was just a drill. In their hurry to leave before international arms inspectors could find them, retreating scientists buried tons of live anthrax spores in the ground. Anthrax spores can survive in soil for centuries. American-funded decontamination teams were still working to secure the site well into the 2000s. A secret weapons island shrank out of existence as a body of water, and the drying sea did something no treaty ever could. It opened a walking path straight to a mass grave of live pathogens. One site's danger came from what was buried and left behind. The next one's danger came from something the Soviets never actually stopped testing: real interceptor missiles aimed at real targets at a facility that never fully closed. On the shore of Lake Balkhash in Kazakhstan sits Shagan, a missile defense proving ground so large it stretches nearly 480 kilometers end to end. The Soviets authorized it in 1956 specifically to test whether they could shoot down an incoming nuclear warhead in mid-flight. In 1961, they proved it. The world's first non-nuclear interception of a ballistic missile warhead happened right here. Over the decades that followed, the site would go on to test roughly a dozen different anti-missile systems, a dozen anti-aircraft missile types, and nearly 20 radar systems, launching interceptors fired from as far away as Kapustin Yar, another Soviet missile range 1,600 kilometers to the west, whose own tests are still classified. In the 1970s, a secretive addition called Terra 3 was built at the site to test directed energy weapons, lasers powerful enough to fuel decades of Cold War rumors, some confirmed, some still unverified, about Soviet ambitions to blind enemy satellites from the ground. After the USSR collapsed, most of this sprawling range was simply abandoned. Equipment was stripped by scavengers for scrap through the 1990s and the 2000s. Buildings sit empty across the steppe with no clear owner willing to clean them up. The town attached to the site itself stayed officially closed to outsiders until 2005. But here's the twist that separates Shagan from almost everywhere else on this list. Part of it never stopped operating. Russia still leases the range from Kazakhstan and continues launching missile defense and anti-satellite tests here, including intercontinental ballistic missile tests as recently as this decade. The same stretch of steppe holds a Cold War ruin and a live weapons range at the same time, side by side. Shagan tested what happens to a missile mid-flight. The final site on this list tested the outer limit of the weapon itself, the single largest explosion any country has ever deliberately created. And it's the one place here that could still be used again. Novaya Zemlya is a frozen, restricted Arctic archipelago stretching across the Barents Sea, and it's home to the largest man-made explosion in human history. The Soviets designated it a nuclear test site in 1954, forcibly relocating the indigenous Nenets population who had lived there for generations in order to clear it out for good. Between 1955 and 1990, it hosted somewhere between 130 and over 200 nuclear detonations, depending on how you count them, split across zones with names like Chernaya Gulf, where the earliest atmospheric and underwater blasts were staged before testing moved further north. The most infamous came on October 30th, 1961. The Tsar Bomba, a 50 megaton thermonuclear weapon, deliberately scaled down from its original 100 megaton design because even the Soviets thought the full version might be too dangerous to test. What they detonated anyway was still nearly 4,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and it caused severe destruction across roughly 100 kilometers of the surrounding landscape. Testing officially ended there in 1990. By every normal logic of a collapsed empire, that should be the end of the story. It isn't. Satellite images from 2021 to 2023 show a construction boom at the site unlike anything seen since testing stopped. New buildings, tunnel excavation work reported nearby, and Russian officials publicly stating that the central test site is ready to resume full-scale nuclear testing if ordered to. The most extreme weapon the Soviets ever built didn't just leave a scar on the map. It left behind a site that, as of right now, might not be finished being history at all. None of these places were ever supposed to still matter. That's exactly why they do. They weren't built as ruins. They were built as proof. Proof that a nuclear war could be fought and survived, that a plague could be weaponized and contained, that a landscape could be reshaped on command, that a missile could always be stopped before it landed. Every one of them was an answer to a question a government was certain it needed to ask. The craters, the tunnels, the empty towns are what's left after that certainty broke down. At Deadliest Mountain, there's a small stone monument, carved in 3 languages, marking the spot where the tunnels were finally sealed. It reads that the world has become safer. It sits on a mountain that is still radioactive underneath. The Cold War ended decades ago. Some of what it built never got the message.